I'd like to introduce tonight's guests, who I'm sure we'd all agree are among our most perceptive, incisive, and influential public intellectuals, both of whom bring a deep, nuanced, and abiding insight into how American history informs the present, as well as a willingness to interrogate and unpack those long-standing narratives. As moderator, we're thrilled to welcome Rebecca Solnit. Yes. Unquestionably one of America's leading literary luminaries, whose work has been at the forefront of issues like climate change, feminism, and the nature of language, and who, in my bookseller opinion, is one of our most reliable cultural curators, for there are very few stronger endorsements to discovering a new artist or thinker than these 4 words on a book. Preface by Rebecca Solnit. Through her prolific books and essays, she's continually championed the writers and thinkers that illuminate rather than obfuscate the chaos of our current world. And tonight, she's in conversation with one of the best embodiments of those qualities, Heather Cox Richardson. Boston College professor, renowned American historian, and leading star of the online news platform Substack through her daily newsletter, Letters from an American. Any subscribers to that newsletter here? Very reassuring. It's the antidote to the toxicity of social media news feeds. She started this late-night newsletter shortly following the impeachment inquiry of President Donald Trump, and it's quickly amassed millions of readers for how it clearly and insightfully chronicles current events, orienting them in the broader sweep of American history. Its success has prompted the New York Times to call her the most successful independent journalist in America. Bay Area book lovers, please extend a warm Booksmith welcome to Heather Cox Richardson and Rebecca Solnit.
It's very exciting to be here, and thank you all so much for coming out tonight. It's really a pleasure to be here. And this is the first time that Rebecca and I have shared a stage in person. So I am crazy excited because, of course, she is one of our best writers in the whole country. And it's exciting to be here.
Oh my God, Heather, it is amazing to be with you. It has been wild watching just the sheer force of what you're doing, the power that it has, and I don't think any other historian has ever done anything remotely like.
Well, yeah, the thing is, it's not about me, and that's, I think, what's cool about this and being here is that it's about us. And that's why this is such an amazing thing, it is incredible to be part of. But did you see this coming 10 years ago?
Which part?
This part. Having so many people out here caring about democracy.
10 years ago, I think was Obama president 10 years ago? I think we're all feeling pretty complacent and like history. Is that better? Ooh, gotta get really close. Okay. 10 years ago, I think Obama was president and we're all feeling pretty comfortable, which was a big mistake. And because it really took the 2016 election to realize how hard the Republicans were going after voting rights and how much that would affect the outcome of, for example, Wisconsin in 2016. So, no. But I also think it's exciting just that in a sense, you're demonstrating the appetite for history in a way we haven't seen before. And I'm excited by you, but I'm really excited by that people want historical context, they want historical meaning, they want to sort of find the pattern in the chaos that comes at us, and you give us that.
Well, I have to say, I had a wonderful time this afternoon. I was doing an interview with somebody, and he asked about the Cleveland administration. And I was like, this is my moment.
Well, we could ask you about Millard Fillmore or John C. Fremont if that would help you settle.
Do not start me, because yeah. No, it's wonderful. And you know, part of the fun of all this for me is getting to invite people into the world that I find so exciting, not only because Grover Cleveland was far more interesting than most people realize, but also because, of course, this is where we get the background for where we are in this moment today. And it's just fun watching this community take shape around these long threads that run through our history.
I wasn't really going to start there. I was really going to start with, like, you're a historian. Oh my God, we had history by the bucket load yesterday. What the hell?
Okay, so I will confess that I usually don't do hard outs, but I was so tired yesterday. If you noticed, I wrote through the weekend because I thought, I've got a brutal schedule today, and I'm just going to post a photo tomorrow night. And Kevin McCarthy did not get the memo. So I'm watching it all day long. I'm doing all these interviews and all this stuff, and I'm watching this all day long, and I'm thinking, please no, don't make history tonight. Do not make history tonight. And of course we did. We've never had a speaker vacated from the chair. And the way it happened, the meaning of what had happened, all the different ramifications and how they continued on all through the night, because of course here we're 3 hours later than what's happening in Washington, and then the way it started up this morning, I'm like, really? Like, of all the nights you had to make history, it's the night that I had 3 hours sleep the night before. I'm on a 3-hour time lag and have just had interviews all day long, and I just looked at that computer and I thought, yeah, I got to do it. So you'll notice if you read the letters that they were there this morning.
Did you see it coming?
This moment we're in?
Yeah, what just happened in the House with McCarthy and Gates?
That's actually a really interesting question because certainly we've seen the challenge coming for a while, but it was not clear to me what the Democrats would do. And we spent a lot of time, those of us who think about these things, trying to figure that out. And so as early as yesterday morning, or as late as yesterday morning when we saw this coming, my friends and I were sitting there going, what do you think's going to happen next? No, what do you think's going to happen next? And I got a wonderful text from somebody who said, well, you can't forget the 1855 Senate race in Illinois. and I was like, indeed, one cannot. Would you like to give me a little bit, because literally I'm sitting there going, well, it's not Lincoln, because he runs in 58. So 55, who's 55 going to be? And it was Lyman Trumbull. And going into that, there was some reason that was very significant. And now even I can't remember it. But literally, we had no idea how it was going to play out until it actually played out. And what's interesting about that was it seems like there were a lot of moving pieces that certainly Kevin McCarthy didn't see coming. And probably Matt Gaetz didn't see coming. And what all those pieces are going to add up to is still a mystery, I think.
I have to say, yesterday I was excited to see McCarthy go, and today when I saw that Jordan and Stephen Scalise are both hoping to get the speakership, I was like, right, there are things that are actually worse than Kevin McCarthy, which is itself a kind of a horrific thought.
So I won't go too deep into the weeds on this because, again, I'm a prophet of the past, not the future. But it's really interesting because Jordan, of course, is going forward as a protege of McCarthy, which is interesting. And yet there's all sorts of other things in play as well, including funding the government in now, I think it's 44 days, and funding Ukraine even more quickly than that. And there's just so many plates spinning, it's really difficult to tell who's spinning them, basically. So you know, it's very rare. I was saying in the back that usually when things happen, people like me have a pretty good sense, not of what's going to happen necessarily, but you can say, oh, I get it, because these people want this, and these people want this, and they want that, and this is happening, and pretty soon there's going to be these 3 possible outcomes, and this is more likely because we're looking at this right now and going, I don't know. Like, it's never happened before. We don't know what's going to happen. And that's one of the reasons that I'm glued to the news right now, because you're watching for the little the little signs, the little things that people may or may not be saying, and that's where we are right now. I got nothing. If you were hoping to figure out who's going to be speaker next, I would not take a bet on anybody right now. I mean, I would take a bet against some people, but I don't think there's any reason to think it's necessarily going to be either Jordan or Scalise.
It is kind of fascinating.
Because remember the Senate election of 1855 in Illinois.
Who could forget it?
When the person
Also
who
fill
won
us
started
in.
with 5 votes, and they needed more than that.
Did you want to tell us about the Senate election of 1855?
That's all I know.
In
That's it.
Illinois?
But the discussion we're having, well, what do you think? Well, I don't know, but you can't forget.
And what is kind of fascinating about the Republicans for me is that in some ways they don't have a plan, in that I feel like your book is about this. They hit a crossroads where the country was becoming increasingly non-white, increasingly progressive. Women had the vote, even though Peter Thiel isn't happy about that. And, and they either had to try and get more votes, or they had to decide to suppress votes and become a minority rule party. And they're well down that road. It feels like as they become more and more a minority party, they have to suppress harder and harder. But that just doesn't seem like a good long-term game plan. And yesterday, sorry, there's not much. I'll do my best. Okay. Ooh, okay, got it. But I'm just fascinated by the way the Republicans are really kind of running themselves in, painting themselves into a corner, I think would be the traditional expression. Where do they go from here? And of course, Trump has co-opted them all, and I don't know. And once Trump got elected, it felt like all bets were off and we were in uncharted territory. But it feels Trump's not president, but things are still wild.
Definitely things are wild. And there's so many interesting strands, because one of the things that I like to emphasize is that Trump is no longer in power. There are a number of reasons to think he's not going to play very well in the 2024 election. Not least, one of the things that's interesting is we haven't really seen him since he was elected president. Like, he was in very tightly scripted scenes during the presidency, but we haven't really seen him since 2020. If you are watching him, like people like me are, he looks awful. He is not and I'm not like, well, he just looks awful, like he's an orange tangerine or whatever. He is unable to articulate things. He's not going to play very well, even to his base. And so there are many ways in which, and of course we have the more than 1,000 indictments over the January 6, 2021 attack on the U.S. Capitol, people going to jail for long periods of time. There are many ways in which it looks like that star is fading. And yet, one of the things I can't stop thinking about today is that one of the front runners to become Speaker of the House, third person in line from the presidency, is Jim Jordan, who was extraordinarily active on January 6th. And one of the things that it's interesting to do right in this moment is to step back. There are so many ways in which you sit there and it's all noise and there's too much going on, and you sit there and think, oh, well, this is going to happen and this is going to happen. But you step back and you think, really? We have 2 front runners for the Speaker? First of all, we have a House in the middle of a term that doesn't have a Speaker. Really? And then second of all, the 2 front runners for it are, one of whom has been instrumental in an attempt to overturn our government, and the other one claimed to be David Duke, the KKK leader, without the baggage. And you think, is it really over? And yet on the other hand, you see the fact that so many people are turning out to say we care about taking our country back for democracy, not for a party of one sort or another, but for democracy, for all the things we're afraid we're losing. So it's a very exciting time. May you live in interesting times.
The title of the book is Democracy Awakening, and I wonder, was Trump the nightmare that woke us up? Were we, this kind of goes back to how we felt 10 years ago. Was there a kind of blithe confidence that the ship would keep sailing steadily until, the drunk captain took over. That was a terrible metaphor. I apologize for it. But it does feel like people wake up in adversity, they wake up in danger. And so I wonder, is the title of the book, Democracy Awakening, partly a response to the crisis of democracy, or entirely the crisis of democracy in this moment?
Yes, so I have said before, when people say to me, why do I have hope? My answer to that is I was far more nervous 8 years ago than I am now, for the simple reason that people like me saw the rise of authoritarianism a long time ago, and people didn't seem to care. So I remember talking to somebody about George W. Bush's use of signing statements, especially around the issue of torture in the United States, and I knew written this piece, and someday I will, because it's really interesting. We actually had a case in Congress about waterboarding during the Spanish-American War at the end of the 19th century, and they talk about it in Congress, and they are horrified that the United States would any time be anywhere near anything like waterboarding, and they're really talking about waterboarding. And here we are in the 20th century, with the president using a signing statement to get rid of the prohibition on torture. And I remember saying to somebody, this is a problem, these signing statements are a problem, and they were like, oh, who really cares? I mean, it's just this is the way they pass laws, and me thinking, oh boy, we're in trouble, and people really weren't paying attention. And the reason the book is called Democracy Awakening is because, not that it had to do with that particular thing, but I hate to do this to you, but in America in 1853, I almost went for the joke about the Senate election in Illinois, but I felt like that horse is probably getting pretty sick. In 1853, if you lived in America, you would have said that the elite enslavers were taking over the country. They had the White House, they had the Senate, they had the Supreme Court, and they were making inroads on the House of Representatives. And it really looked like they were going to do what they promised, that is, take over the United States and turn it into a fully slave-holding nation and use that extraordinary concentration of wealth that was enabling them to have in order to spread their system around the globe. They were not shy about this. They're saying, this is what we are going to do. This is the wave of the future, and we are going to be a beacon for the world of the efficient use of labor as it relates to racial enslavement. Well, this is the way it's going to be. 1854, they get Congress, including the House of Representatives, to pass a law making that possible so they can spread enslavement into the West. By 1856, all those people who were like, yeah, we don't really care what government is doing, they took a look at that law in 1854 and said, listen, we may not agree about anything to do with finances or internal improvements or immigration or religion, but by God, we can agree that we belong to live in a democracy, that we should live in a democracy. So by 1856, they have created a new political party to stand against the elite enslavers. By 1859, they've recruited this lawyer to start to figure out what they should stand for. By 59, he has articulated a new set of values for that party that call for a government that helps ordinary Americans rather than the rich enslavers. By 1860, he's elected to the White House. By 1861, he has signed the Emancipation Proclamation outlawing human enslavement in the nation. And by 1863, he has given the Gettysburg Address dedicating the nation to a new birth of freedom based in the Declaration of Independence. Less than 10 years, we go from we are making this globe beholden to elite slave owners to we stand for equality. And when I think of the moment we're in now, it looks to me like the 1850s. And we have had the wake-up call of 1854. And a lot of people who are like, yeah, whatever, I don't care what's happening. Or, I really don't like that other group people's stand on immigration, are saying, listen, we can work all that stuff out the same way Lincoln said, but by God, we stand for democracy. And that's why the cover is a sunrise.
I knew I could get John C. Fremont in here, who, of course, is the first Republican candidate on an anti-slavery platform in 1856. But yeah, the beginnings of the anti-slavery movement as this kind of puny thing. I was reading recently about women abolitionists, selling crafts at fairs to pay for speakers like Frederick Douglass, and it's like, who the hell thinks they're going to make pincushions and bring down a powerful institution, except they did. That is kind of...
I love that. Except they did. How many people say to you, well, I'm just one person. I can't do this. What am I going to do? I'm just one person. Make a damn pincushion.
Yeah, So, I hope you're right. I hope we're in that version of the 1850s. But what's fascinating for me, dealing with climate and other things, and it was really George W. Bush who made me start writing about hope, is that a lot of people are really attached to certainty, and that's often a kind of defeatism of, I know what's going to happen, so nothing is required of me. And that can be optimism, everything will be fine, I'm going to sit back, or it can be, we're all doomed, therefore I can still sit back. And the radical uncertainty that you describe, what was going to happen with slavery, and it was so out in the open in the 1850s. And I'm so tempted. You're going to come back. I'm going to take you to see the memorial, the secret memorial to Mary Ellen Pleasant, who funded John Brown. The trees she planted are still growing here. She was Black and part of the Underground Railroad. And you can find her trees on Sutter at Laguna, I think, in San Francisco. But anyway, but it is such an uncertain moment, and I don't think the Republicans can win, but I don't assume that they can't either. And it is interesting, just this moment that really calls on us all. I think after the 2016 election, people were like, if you ever wondered what you would have done under the Third Reich, here's your chance. But, it really is a moment of such uncertainty, but I think yesterday is a reminder that we don't know what's going to happen, and especially if we're Kevin McCarthy, but we really don't know, and partly because the future is being made in the present. You can probably tell a counter-history of the 1850s in which people don't push hard enough, in which the commitments aren't strong enough, in which the idealism isn't expressed powerfully enough to push back against that other future they were planning.
Well, one of the things that really jumps out to me when you look at the Florida curriculum, for example, which was a mirror of what had happened in Texas and in Oklahoma, was that when people focus on the stripping out in that curriculum of minority histories, the pushback was always, well, no, there's that stuff in there, right? Although, never mind, the curriculum is somewhat problematic. That's an understatement. But if you really look at it, what it's really stripped out is not specific kinds of history. What is stripped out is agency. Nobody who is doing anything in that curriculum is in any way pushing back against the status quo. So you can say, as somebody said to me, well, look at all the Black figures that are in the Florida curriculum. Well, they're there, but they're there reinforcing the status quo. Even in their protests, they are doing so in order to make sure that the system stays the way it is. And that, to me, is far more frightening than simply saying, well, there were indigenous people in Florida too, which is one of the other problems with that particular set of curricula. But one of the points that I've tried to make in what I do, and one of the reasons that I'm actually interested in the way the book turned out, I think I've said elsewhere that it started just being a series of essays about the questions that people ask me all the time. How did the party switch sides? What's the Southern strategy? What about we're not a democracy, we're a republic, which I get every single day. And what I discovered was that when I put the manuscript aside and came back to it, it told me a very different story. And I ended up throwing out about 80% of it and rewriting it, because what I found was exactly what you say, that the idea that we had a perfect past, I think supports the rise of authoritarianism. That is, the idea that we could go back to a perfect time If only somebody would adhere to a series of laws that are divine or that are handed down by the universe. And the reason we're not doing that is because of those people, whoever those people are, is a version of American history and a version of life that is preordained. We don't have agency. All we have to do is go back to what it was. But real American democracy, which is the third section of this book, the second section is really scary. You might, like, I got halfway through it and I'm like, wow, I don't want to finish this book. But the third section's pretty good, because what it says is democracy is always under construction. There is no end to it. It is always about agency, and it is always about marginalized people saying, hey, listen, you keep talking about everybody being equal before the law and having an equal right to a say in their government. I want that too. And if we do that, if we realize it's constantly changing, constantly expanding, and sometimes backsliding, it's a vibrant way of existence that offers everybody agency. And at the end of the day, that's really what not only democracy, I think, but human life is about, is self-determination. And that, to me, it's certainly frightening. Things could go badly, but think of how well they could go, too. I mean, think of the art, think of the literature, think of the new ways of thinking about the world, think about the ways we could address climate change or injustice around the world, or homelessness, or any of the many things that we have to address to move forward in this century. And all the answers we could come up with if only we dared. And democracy, I think, is about daring.
I've been wondering more and more if despair partly comes from lack of memory. If nothing else, the present always tells us that it wasn't inevitable that it was this way, and it wasn't always this way. And I wonder if that's some of the ways you use the past in the, that incredible volume of essays you've been giving us since 2019, is to remind us that we're in a process of change, which is about agency, that the world has been changed for the better, for the worse, that public participation has shifted things.
Well, yes, and one of the things about understanding history is recognizing that it's never finished, and everybody's scared most of the time. And every time I think I just don't want to deal with whatever's in front of me, I think neither did anybody in 1863. Or in 1862, when they, in Maine, when people marched off to war in 1862 during the Civil War, and that would be the 21st Maine and the 20th Maine, the one that's so famous, they weren't really thinking they were going to go out and save the world, because in the summer of 1862, the United States troops were losing on the battlefields, and people were dying in truly horrific ways, from disease as well as from the battlefield. But they were broke. I mean, things were in really bad shape, so they were marching off to war really to feed their families and hoping. And I just think of, there's actually, my husband's family sent a number of people to the war. And one woman watched her husband and her father walk off together in the summer of 62. One went to the 60th Maine and one went to the 20th Maine, and the other one went to the 21st. And recognizing that they probably would never come home. And one of them didn't. One died from a disease he picked up, and the other one did make it home wounded. But thinking, she didn't want to be there either. She didn't want to lose those people, but by God, she did it. And the same with World War II, the people who fought in World War II. And one of my favorite stories is I was kind of bored one day, and I was writing a piece on the crash of 29. And everybody writes about the crash. I'm like, I don't want to write about the crash. I want to write about the night before the crash. Like, what was it like? So I did this research, and there's this huge party in New York City because it's the opening of the opera, and everybody's wearing diamonds and all this kind of stuff. And there's this little tiny piece in the New York Times about this guy who dies by suicide that night because he has lost everything, and he's a financial wreck, and he feels like he can never pull it back together. And I remember looking at that going, dude, hang on one more day. Because in one more day, you're going to find out there's millions of people just like you, including all those people in diamonds. And of course, I couldn't change it for him, but it certainly suggests that just hanging on one more day changes the entire picture. So every time I look at that and I think, I can't do this again, I think, I don't have to do it forever. Just got to do it for one more day.
Well, there's two directions that I think of going with that, but one is like, you started this with the letters from an American with the first impeachment, right, in 2019. Did you have any idea what you're getting yourself into?
So I'm smiling a little bit about this, and I don't think Rebecca knows this. So I started in September 15th, 2019. It's a pretty well-known story now. I got stung by a yellow jacket. I'm allergic. I didn't have an EpiPen. I was sitting there trying to figure out what I should do next. I thought I'll just write an essay, as one does. No, I mean, it's a little bit more complicated than that, but I'm laughing a little bit because I was writing essays on Facebook, largely about life or history or whatever. And you know what my biggest moment ever was writing those? My biggest moment ever? I wrote one about being in high school, and Rebecca Solnit liked it. And she doesn't know this. I took screenshots of it, and I sent it to my friends, and I'm like, oh my God, I'm a writer now. So yeah, I started from that, that was probably in 2017, and I started these in 2019, and no, I never intended to do this. I'm just answering people's questions. Even still, I'm just answering people's questions, except now I have the added benefit that I'm keeping the record for the nation, and that, I cannot tell you. I mean, I'm excited about what's happening in this country in so many ways, but for a historian, to be the person keeping the record for the country at a time like this, there is literally nobody in this country ever who has been luckier than the person sitting right here. So people say to me, take the night, if I hear one more time, take the night off, why don't you just take a night off? Well, really? Like, I've kept the record every night for more than 4 years. What, you think I'm gonna go home and eat Milk Duds? Not happening,
Maybe whiskey? It's also kind of fascinating because when Trump got elected, I think a lot of people felt the call. It was like being called up to service, but not to military service. Timothy Snyder, Amy Siskind, who kept that list inspired by Timothy Snyder, Erica Chenoweth, who started monitoring demonstrations for scale. The Women's March became an anti-Trump, march, and Indivisible started, etc. It's interesting that for you, the call really came in 2019.
No, actually, it's really interesting you picked that up. I was the first day that Charlie Kirk did the Professor Watch List. That was a really hastily thrown together website, and he grabbed a bunch of names, and one of the names he grabbed was mine. And I could tell you how that happened. It really had very little to do with, quite frankly, anything. But I came down to, this was in right after the election. It was in November of 2016. And I came down my stairs. My kitchen was really dark at the time. And I'm in my jammies, right? And I opened my laptop, making my coffee. And my laptop is exploding with people, God, are you okay? Or, oh my God. And I'm thinking, I'm just making my coffee. Like, what happened here? And people were so concerned that I wrote a letter responding to them about what he had done. And that went viral. And I recognized that I couldn't shut up at that point. That I was already on I was on the professor watch list. And I was sort of out there, sort of against my will, but that was okay. And it was interesting. I said to one of my children, I said, I can be silent if you would like, if you're frightened. And he said, if we can't trust you, who can we trust? So I've been out there ever since, but I was mostly writing books. I mean, I think somewhere in there I wrote, isn't that, I don't remember when it came out, but I think I wrote How the South Won the Civil War and all that. Yeah, I did. And then, and so I was writing for newspapers and stuff because it just never occurred to me that people would want to read the stuff I write is quite complicated, and it just never occurred to me that millions of people wanted to hear what was happening in congressional committees, but they do, which is really cool.
And we all want to know about Illinois in 1853, obviously.
I got to tell you, it's coming, right?
And Grover Cleveland now more than ever. But
You know, I could write Cleveland in the present. I actually could, but maybe I'll write about it instead.
we look forward to that letter. We look forward to that letter. I think that in a way I see you doing what the media fails to do. I went. Well, that pushed a button. I went to journalism school. Am I pointing towards UC Berkeley over there? Okay. Thank you. I'm directionally challenged in here, but not outside. But there's a way I think that the U.S. media is so convinced that context is editorializing and the job is to be neutral and objective, that they really strip down their reporting, and every lie Trump told was reported in isolation, whereas the meaning only comes from the pattern of lies. You know, that the way that history rhymes, the way that the patterns emerge, et cetera, is how we make meaning of it. And I feel like a lot of what you gave us is by constantly situating what happened yesterday in the larger context, sometimes going all the way back to the Founding Fathers or the Civil War, sometimes just to give a kind of background, really gave us something we weren't getting, which is tracing the patterns, finding the meanings, the kind of reassurance that this isn't the first time we've been in turmoil, but also just that seeing the pattern that I think the media, the news business is kind of afraid to show. And I wonder if that makes sense to you. Another thing that's exciting about it is, you know, your success for me has been exciting, aside from the fact that I adore you, that I had no idea there was such an immense appetite for history, and that people want to read about history, as it now 4 times a week, is pretty encouraging, among other things.
So there's a joke among my graduate students, and it does not originate with me, but they have associated it with me, and that's that whenever they start a project, I always say, that's great, that's really interesting, who cares? And it's a kind of a joke now, I hope at least, and we work through who cares, and there's actually, we'll talk about this at some point about writing, that's the way in to figure out where your bridge is to your readers, because if you care about it, they will care about it. You just got to figure out why anybody should care about it. But that's what historians do. Journalists tell you what happened. Historians explain how that fits into the larger story of how societies change. So I think I have a real advantage over journalists in this what you're talking about, because I am trained, I understand what the theories are, how one looks for those patterns in a way that somebody who is busily figuring out what the latest moving piece is might not be able to do. And I will say one of the things that's interesting is the varying qualities of our journalistic pools around the country. So I got to tell you, the Defense Department journalist pool is phenomenal. If you want to see really good journalists at work, watch the defense pressers every day. Or the State Department people are very good as well. Others are maybe less strong, but those are places where they know exactly what they're talking about, they know exactly what they're doing. But one of the things that is interesting for me and what I'm trying to do is, it's not, I mean, it makes it sound like I have a real plan, and I really don't. I generally am writing about what I think is interesting, what I think is important, and how to understand it. So the letters actually take a crazy amount of time because, for example, you know, you probably know the outlines of a story, but to put in all the detail, I have to do the research on that too. And it just takes a long time. If you're looking up the statement that somebody made, you got to find their webpage, you know, anyway, whatever. But it's easier for me because I'm always trying to figure out if you were a graduate student in 150 years, and I have a vision of her, by the way, what do you need to know about today? What will she need to know? And what's interesting about that is that a lot of the stories that seem a little bit to be throwaways to me become recurring. So some of the people that I thought were just there come back. So, and I'm going to use this example, and I mean, I don't know the man or anything, but Chris Krebs was the man who was in charge of the cybersecurity division under the Trump White House, hired during the administration, and the one who said, yeah, this election was secure. He's promptly fired, and I thought, well, bye, Chris, you know? And he's come back. He's become a really fervent defender of cybersecurity. He's very anti-Trump now. And it's interesting to me the way the patterns continue to play out. If you had told me the first time I mentioned him that I would need to continue to know about him, I'm like, oh no, he's just one of those many functionaries and I'll never see him again. And it's interesting how those patterns keep repeating. Now, partly because I'm the person looking for those patterns, but a lot of names just keep coming back when you don't expect them. So a lot makes it easier for a journalist is looking and seeing, if it were 150 years from now, what do I want to know? One of the things I did not write about last night, because I couldn't for the life of me figure out how to fit it in, was the fact that the WHO was considering and today approved a malaria vaccine. That's huge. I mean, that was the biggest story in the world yesterday, although it hadn't been approved. The WHO approved it this morning. I'm a little fuzzy on time today, but I think that's right. But that's something somebody's going to want to know in 150 years, you know? They probably are not going to want to know that Trump melted down again. It's just not a story anymore.
I think we're getting close to time for questions, but from the audience, I can see the index cards being furiously sorted. But I do think about that graduate student historian in 150 years, because I feel like just the way people like you are sorting through what really happened in the Civil War and how to think about it, we're in another era like that, where the country imploded, got full of conflict, violence, and I don't know how many people have a real sense of that, but have you thought about that this is a really a kind of second Civil War? Maybe because you wrote how the South won the Civil War, the one where we're finally trying to win the Civil War that we let go last time.
So yes, I think that one of the things that is very apparent to, I think, all of us really, but certainly someone like me, is we are certainly in a global moment that will determine our fates and the fates of this globe. And anybody who doesn't think that is living under a rock. And one of the reasons I think that we're all as anxious as we are, as all as eager to figure out how to move forward, is because we recognize that. And while certainly the United States has domestic issues and the globe has international issues the way it always has, we have your department, which is climate change, hanging over our heads. And the decisions we make today matter forever, in a way that in the 1860s, if the United States had screwed up, whatever, I mean, that sounds very flippant, but the globe was going to keep on going. We messed this one up. I guess the globe's going to be just fine, but the people living on it are not. And that, I think, adds a special urgency to the moment we're in now. I mean, I would really like the United States to do this right. I would really like the globe to do this right. But at the end of the day, if we don't do it right, we don't have the leeway that people had before us, which is one of the reasons it's so crucially important to get involved and to do it right now.
We talk about that a lot with climate, and this is what gets called the decade of decision, and not just for humanity, for oceans, for forests, for polar ice, for the circumpolar world, for the tropics, for the coral reefs. And, you know, it's more than human life. And it is kind of an amazing moment where I don't know what's going to happen, but I do know that it is time to turn it over to...
Well, you know, one of the things that always jumps out at me about this is people say to me, you know, how can you be so hopeful about the future? And my answer is, of course, you've heard me say this before, I believe in people and I believe in the concept of human self-determination and I believe in democracy. But in a way, I have to believe in those things because the flip side of that is unthinkable. So if we accept that that's an option, we're creating that option. I don't want to create that option. I want to say we're gonna fix it because we don't have an option. And that seems to me to be a much more hopeful position than saying, I don't know what's gonna happen. It feels like you're putting your thumb on the scale to say, it is gonna happen and it's gonna happen right.
I just always feel like we're steering between fatalism that we're all doomed and optimism that everything will be fine. And the uncertainty for me is room to act, to know that we don't know the future because we make it in the present, that we have agency, and I think that the possibilities look good. I do believe in that graduate student in 150 years. I believe there will be graduate students and historians. And
I believe in the joy of creation, which is another thing we really don't talk about. That this is frightening in a lot of ways. It's hopeful in a lot of ways. But the creation is fun. Like at 4 o'clock in the morning, I'm not glued to the chair just because I feel like I have to be. We're building something, and having the joy of building something and working hard to make something happen, that itself is, I think, a vote for the future.
I think it's exciting too. And first question, what can we do to mitigate fake news and propaganda? Is it time to rethink the First Amendment, or is it too little with AI, et cetera?
That's a great question, and I would say, first of all, it's never too late to grab hold of the First Amendment and hold it tight to your chest, because that sucker really matters. That being said, it's really interesting, and there's a theory, of course, I've talked about this a lot, a political theory that is really articulated best by Russian political thinkers, but it really is all over the United States as well, and that's the idea that you undermine democracy by creating a false reality. It's called virtual politics or political technology, and you do it by flooding the zone with crap, the way Steve Bannon talked about it, or by running false candidates, or by running candidates who say they're in one party and they flip to another party, or there's a number of ways to get people to vote against their interests. And what's interesting to me about that creation of that sphere of disinformation is what happens when people recognize the tools that have been used against them. And one of the things that I think actually happened in the 1850s, although they didn't have all the tools we have now, they had plenty of new ones for the time, is that the resistance to that overturning of democracy takes those same tools and repurposes them to restore their democracy, the same way that they did in the 1850s and the same way that other countries have done when they have lost their own democracies. So I personally would like to see the government begin to crack down on the algorithms that are falsely elevating the voices that are in fact not real, or where 2 people suddenly become 2 million people. I would like to see them do that. That has nothing to do with the First Amendment. That has to do with access to markets. Which we do regulate. But other than that, as I always say, take up oxygen. Take up oxygen. Make sure that those voices are not being responded to, because in a sense, if you say, well, you're wrong, you're accepting the parameters that the other people have set up, but are drowned out by a different narrative saying, no, it's not okay, for example, when a police officer executes somebody that he's arresting. I don't care if that person's guilty or not. That's not the way our system works. Or say, I believe in equality before the law, even if you're an ex-president, or any of the many things that we care about in our society, or that you care about in our society. And that, I think, is how you push back against disinformation in this moment while still retaining the First Amendment.
2 related questions. One is about, has there ever been a time with so much disinformation? I'm very interested in your answer to that one. The other, can you please speak to the challenge of the First Amendment versus people with power, large platforms, aka Trump, Bannon, et cetera, inciting violence through their rhetoric? Where's the line drawn?
Okay, so there's a couple of questions there. The first is disinformation is absolutely nothing new. And my favorite example of this, and I could give you a gazillion, but my favorite example of this is in the early 19th century, one of the best ways to win an election was to tell the newspapers your opponent was dead. You know? And really, how do you come back from that? You run around going, I'm not dead, I'm not dead, I'm not dead. So, I mean, that's something that obviously we go with sort of stuff like that. But disinformation is nothing new. What is new is exactly what you're talking about, the amplification of all these voices that make it look as if a majority is a minority. So one of the great statistics, of course, is that more than 70%, significantly more than 70% of Americans want common sense gun safety legislation. And you would think that those of us who want those things are, 4 people in a basement, when really it's the other way around. And that, I think, the flooding of disinformation, this is why I would like to see algorithms taken care of. But I'm a big believer in the First Amendment, but I do think the First Amendment's really never been about, I shouldn't say that. The real issue in the First Amendment is access, and adjusting access of people like you're mentioning here is something that is within the Constitution, that can be done within the Constitution, and would go a long way. My Facebook page, for example, I have a full-time, moderator or something, administrator, who does nothing but zap the fake accounts. Hundreds of thousands of fake accounts. Now, you know full well Facebook could do that. And they choose not to because it looks like their numbers are higher than they are. That's something that we could take care of, and I would love to see that done.
You're speaking to trouble created by Silicon Valley, and here we are. I used to be really proud of this part of the world, which I grew up in. And now with Mark Zuckerberg and Elon Musk and Peter Thiel and the rest,
Well, I will say every new technology we get, we all go, oh my God, it's going to be great. And then it turns into a cesspool, no matter what it is. And then we clean it up. And so we're getting into the let's clean it up phase.
I hope so. Elizabeth Warren, now more than ever. And actually, the Amazon lawsuit seems very exciting, the anti-monopoly stuff. Great question. What can we do to help Ukraine? One, now that there is no funding from the U.S. for 45 days. 2, in general.
So one of the things that if you've been following this fight today, one of the things that people who support funding for the Ukraine are asking people to do is to call your Congress people repeatedly and constantly and saying you demand funding for Ukraine. Because while they are deciding about a speaker in the House and while the Senate is actually moving forward on funding right now, they need pressure. And pressure really does matter. It really does matter. So, look at the fact that Justice Clarence Thomas recused himself from a case involving January 6th. And believe me, yes, he might have done that just for appearances because it was one that was going to be lost with or without his vote, but he would not have done that were there not pressure on him. So that would be a good thing in the short term. And in the long term, it's really interesting. One of the things that you should be doing if you're not is following the Institute for the Study of War, which every day does a very brief report on the various wars. The Institute for the Study of War, ISW, follows wars around the world and does a very brief report on them every day, and they're really worth reading. And one of the things that they have been talking about is the advances that Ukraine is making. Incremental, it's not going to be a short thing, but just today the Black Fleet pulled out of Crimea, which again is really, that's a huge deal. The Russians' Black Fleet from Russia has had to pull out of its base in Sevastopol because it's not viable any longer. That's a big deal, right? So continuing to follow that and continuing to put pressure on legislators to fund the resistance in Ukraine, which, by the way, is only about 5% of our defense budget, and our foreign aid budgets is about 1% of the foreign aid we give is about 1% of our budget. So the fact that basically Ukraine has thrown itself into the war against Russia and has hamstrung what 3 years ago was one of our top 2 geopolitical foes for about 5% of our defense budget is the idea that this is a poor use of money is just absolutely not a legitimate argument. So yeah, that's for Ukraine. That's what I would do.
I know you don't know what the Dems would do re McCarthy. Do you think they did the right thing? And then, let's see.
The question is, do I think that the Democrats did the right thing by not backing McCarthy? And the answer to that is twofold. The first is, if Nancy Pelosi told me to jump off a cliff because it was the right political thing to do, so I would always defer to anything that, because she is not uninvolved in anything that's going on there. But it was absolutely the logical thing for the Democrats to do, not least because McCarthy has been really disingenuous about his relationship with the Democrats and with the extremists. And aside from anything else, for the Democrats to support a person who had agreed to open hearings into the establishment of an impeachment inquiry into a president when there really is no evidence for it at all, that would have been a real weakening of the Democratic coalition. And I don't see what they could have done. I think he really forced them into it. Really interesting piece today came out about that continuing resolution in the budget and the fact that McCarthy sprung it on the Democrats without wanting to give them any time to read it. And the person writing about it, who's a staffer for a Congress critter, said that their guess was that he was hoping they would vote it down so he could then blame the Democrats for shutting down the government. But they managed to read it quickly enough to say, yeah, we can live with this. And you can see why they didn't feel like they could work with that.
Do we have any hope of ditching the Electoral College? If so, how?
So I'm with you on that. The Electoral College was an odd thing to begin with. I could explain why they thought they could do it, but remember, as early as 1800, my buddy Thomas Jefferson, it's a joke because I'm not a fan of Thomas Jefferson, had already perverted it. It was supposed to be representational, and he figured out that if, in fact, it was winner take all, if he got the votes from Virginia, he would have become president in 1796. So in 1800, he gets Virginia to go winner take all, and of course, all the other states go, crap, we got to do it too. If, in fact, people want to keep the Electoral College, which is badly skewed now, in addition to everything else, but by the addition, of course, of the 6 states we got between 1889 and 1890 that basically have no people in them: South Dakota, North Dakota, Wyoming, Idaho, Montana, and Washington. In addition to the fact it's skewed by that, it's also skewed by the fact that in 1929, the Congress capped the House of Representatives. And because they recognized that more people lived in cities than were living in the country at the time, and the cities were full of immigrants. So that's why they capped the House of Representatives. If, in fact, the House of Representatives had continued to grow at the same rate that it had before 1929, we would have more than 1,000 people in Congress. And if that were the case, states like California would be much differently represented. That raising of the number of people who are in each congressional district has badly undercounted people in larger states, which I'm sure comes as news to people in this room. But at the very least, that has to be taken care of, the crazy representation. But in terms of the Electoral College, if there are people who insist on still keeping the Electoral College, which no longer has any function except to let minority rule prevail, then at the very least we should go back to the representational system that James Madison said that he wanted to amend the Constitution to make an absolute rule. Right now only Maine and Nebraska have representational Electoral College votes, and they each only have 3 people in the Electoral College. So I'm not a fan of the Electoral College. I think it needs to be dealt with. In the short term, at least, we could go back to representation, but it must be dealt with in the short term rather than the long term, because it does reinforce minority rule.
Aren't a number of states essentially overruling it?
With the popular vote compact, yes.
Yes.
But you got to have enough people to do that, because if you don't, then it's all or nothing, or it's a majority or nothing.
Last two questions, because I know we need to wind this up and you need to deal with the fact that we're 3 hours later than where you live. How do we get journalists to call people like Trump on their lies? And it's like faint pencil and interesting light, misinformation and disinformation. And if this was Germany,
The first question is, how do we get journalists to call it out like it is, and to call out disinformation?
disinformation, lies, and misinformation. And second question, if this was Germany before the rise of Hitler, how could media help prevent the rise of authoritarianism now?
So I can't ever speak to another country. I'm an Americanist. The people, I was actually trained in American history, American literature, and American religion, not any other country. So people get very angry when I won't comment on other countries. I always comment on other countries with regard to their relationship to us, but I don't have any of the skills you need to comment on any other country. I've never been trained in that. I've not read the body of literature. I don't know the theories. That's totally out of my lane. That being said, if you want journalists to report differently, tell them. Write to people, write to ombuds people, write to contact information, and make it known that this is not the kind of journalism you want to read or see. But before you worry too much about that, there are fabulous writers out there that are not writing for mainstream newspapers. They really are terrific. So, I always hate to give names because I'm always afraid of the people that I will forget. Laura Rosen in diplomatic history, Joyce White Vance in legal stuff. She writes every night. Now, of course, they're all, Judd Legum, if you're looking for sort of progressive, in-depth, hard-hitting investigative journalism. The Tennessee Holler is covering Tennessee. I mean, if you're interested, I retweet these people. That's the best way to find them through me. Is I rarely any longer write on Twitter. I just retweet the people who are really good. Ian Millhiser, who writes for Vox, anything he writes is brilliant. Zach Beecham, I finally learned how to pronounce it, writes on political ideology, and he writes for Vox. David Rothkopf writes on diplomatic history in the Daily Beast. They're really good writers. Jennifer Rubin in the Washington Post is always on point. So is E.J. Dion, also in the Post. There are really good writers out there, and they're, of course, worth raising up. But it's also okay to write and say, listen, I can't read your coverage any longer. And you will note that a number of places, including CNN, has been hiring people who are writing much longer, much more in-depth, much more hard-hitting pieces than they were even a few months ago. So I do think that that is actually working. And the question, I can't answer anything that went on in Germany, but what I can say that I think is a key answer to where we are right now is we have not for a long time been operating in a reality-based public discourse. And that is, that I think is the road to authoritarianism. Because so long as we are all operating in reality, we will not, most of us in this room, come up with identical answers to what we think the government should do in reaction to that reality. But at least we have a shared reality. And one of the things that I think is very effective in this moment is calling out the papers, for example, or the journalists who, I don't actually watch TV, so I always think in print media, who are misrepresenting what is happening. So, for example, we are not in this moment in a crisis in Congress. The Democrats are incredibly organized. They're incredibly on message. Joe Biden got an unbelievable amount of stuff done in 2 years. It was a historic presidency. And yet, and the Republicans are, I mean, those of us who watch this, we're aghast. We're just, I mean, aside from anything else, you threw out your own speaker? Like it's never been done because you don't do that. And to see that represented in the papers yesterday as Congress in crisis was a journalistic crisis as well. And I think that's okay to say stop it. Talk about what really happened here, rather than trying to both sides everything, because this is not a horse race. This is an attempt to reestablish a reality-based community in a world in which one of our major political parties has given up on democracy. And this is not about who won in Trump's latest whatever, or what, whether Joe Biden, I mean, the report on Biden's speech on democracy the other day that was reported in the Times as Biden attacks Trump. And I was like, really? That's not what that speech was about at all. I think it's really important to call that out, simply because whether you're a Republican or a Democrat or a Martian, we must be sharing the same reality. And that's something that, regardless of what a journalist is trying to accomplish, that they owe us.
It's 8:17. I think I'm going to call it an event. Thank you so much, everybody. Thank you,
Thank you all
Heather.
for being here. Thank you for being here.